we begin a journey into one of history's most shocking and closely guarded secrets. This is a story so forbidden that for centuries, it was literally hidden away in locked drawers, whispered about in hushed tones among trusted friends, and considered by the guardians of society to be more dangerous, more corrupting than poison itself. What if I told you that for hundreds of years, there was something so powerful, so subversive, so threatening to the very foundation of civilization, that half the population was banned from even touching it? We are not talking about weapons or explosives. We are not talking about political treatises or books of black magic. We are talking about love stories. Yes, you heard that right. Women were forbidden from reading romance novels. And the reasons why, the deep-seated fears, the bizarre medical theories, and the naked desire for control will absolutely blow your mind. You will discover the dark and often absurd truth behind one of history's longest-running moral panics. You will meet the brave women who risked their reputations, their freedom, and even their sanity to smuggle, share, and protect these forbidden books. And you will learn how a simple novel, a story of love and desire, could supposedly turn a proper, pious lady into what an entire society called a dangerous revolutionary. This isn't just a story about books. This is a story about control, about fear, and about the incredible, untamable power of the female imagination, a power that terrified an entire civilization. Before we unlock these forbidden library doors together, I'd love to invite you to join our circle of literary detectives. If you believe that history is full of untold stories that deserve to be brought into the light, consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. It lets me know you're part of this expedition into the past. And I'm genuinely curious. Are you listening to this tucked into bed with a cup of tea, or are you on a late-night drive? Drop a comment below and let me know where this story finds you tonight. Everyone in love, knowing where in the world our community gathers. Dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step back in time and uncover why something as seemingly innocent as a love story was once considered the most dangerous thing a woman could possibly possess. The first moral panic, a republic in peril. The year is 1789. It is a quiet, chilly evening in a cozy New England home. The world outside is still reeling from the echoes of one revolution, while the whispers of another in France are just beginning to cross the Atlantic. The candles are flickering, casting long, dancing shadows on the simple wooden walls. The air smells of wood smoke and drying herbs. And upstairs, behind a locked bedroom door, a young woman named Sarah is committing an act that could ruin her reputation, her marriage prospects, and her place in respectable society forever. She is not entertaining a secret lover. She is not stealing money from her father's strongbox. She is not plotting treason. She is reading a book. But this is not just any book. Her fingers tremble slightly as they trace the words on the page of a slim, leather-bound volume. She is holding a copy of The Power of Sympathy, America's very first novel. And according to her stern father, her fire and brimstone pastor, and pretty much every man in a position of authority, this seemingly innocent act of reading could destroy her mind, corrupt her soul, and turn her into what they ominously called a fallen woman. A woman no decent man would marry, a blight upon her family's name. It sounds absolutely ridiculous to our modern ears, doesn't it? All across colonial America and into the early years of the Republic, women were hiding books like precious contraband, passing them secretly between friends, and creating elaborate schemes just to read a simple love story. And here's the truly shocking part. Some of these women were thrown out of their homes, disowned by their families, or even sent to asylums for what was given an actual medical diagnosis. Book madness. What was so profoundly terrifying about women reading romance novels that it triggered what historians now recognize as America's first major moral panic? The answer lies in something much deeper and more sinister than the books themselves. It lies in the very foundation of the new American Republic, which, for all its talk of liberty, was built on a rigid patriarchal structure. Female virtue was seen as the bedrock of the nation's moral health. A woman's role, her sacred duty in Republican motherhood, was to be silent, obedient, pious, and a moral anchor for her family. A love story, therefore, represented something absolutely revolutionary. It was a dangerous, seductive idea that women could have their own thoughts, their own rich inner lives, their own desires, and their own dreams of happiness independent of their assigned roles. It suggested that a woman might choose a partner based on love, not on her father's approval or financial stability. In a society built on control, this was an act of treason. Let me tell you about Charlotte Temple. Published in America in 1794. This little novel by Susanna Rowson tells the story of a young English schoolgirl who is seduced by a dashing British officer, elopes with him to America, is abandoned while pregnant, and ultimately dies in poverty and shame. It was intended to be a cautionary tale, a story fathers and pastors should have loved. The book became so popular among American women that it sparked what newspapers of the day called Charlotte Temple fever. Women were lining up at bookstores, hiding copies under their mattresses, and reading passages aloud to each other in secret. And here's the part that really freaked out the male establishment. They began treating Charlotte as a real person. They made pilgrimages to what they believed was her grave in New York City's Trinity Churchyard, leaving flowers, small tokens, and weeping for a character they knew was entirely fictional. They were, in essence, creating their own female saint, a martyr to love and male perfidy. The men in charge went absolutely ballistic. Preachers delivered fire and brimstone sermons warning that reading Charlotte Temple was like drinking poison dressed as honey, a sweet concoction that would lead to spiritual death, including the esteemed Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, claimed that romantic literature, with its focus on passion and emotion, could cause inflammation of the brain and nervous disorders in the delicate female constitution. One particularly dramatic physician in Philadelphia actually wrote a medical paper arguing that reading love stories could overstimulate a woman's reproductive organs, leading to a state of constant agitation that would make her infertile. They literally believed a book about romance could stop women from having babies. But here's what's really fascinating, and this is where it gets kind of funny in a dark way. While these men were having complete meltdowns about women reading love stories, they seemed perfectly fine with men reading the exact same books. In fact, many of these dangerous novels were actually written by men for men as warnings about the dangers of female sexuality and emotionality. The irony is absolutely delicious, isn't it? The real issue was never the content of the books. It was what happened inside a woman's mind when she read them. When a woman read about a heroine making her own choices, fighting for her own happiness, or, heaven forbid, choosing her own romantic partner, something magical and terrifying happened. Why can't I make my own choices, too? This fear was so real that some families literally locked up their books. In wealthy households, libraries had separate sections for ladies' reading, which usually consisted of religious texts, housekeeping manuals, and heavily censored poetry. The novels with passion, adventure, and independent female characters was kept in what they called the gentleman's collection, complete with actual locks and keys. And it wasn't just individual families. Churches created official reading lists. Schools banned certain books. Even the early lending libraries had separate sections, and librarians trained to refuse certain books to female customers. But the real heroes of our story are the ordinary women who refused to be silenced. They created what historians now call underground reading networks, secret systems for sharing banned books. Picture a colonial-era version of a book club, but with all the excitement and danger of a spy network. Women would hide novels in their sewing baskets, pass them along during church socials, and even develop coded language to discuss their favorite stories without getting caught. One particularly clever group of women in Boston created what they called the Literary Tea Society. On the surface, it looked like a perfectly respectable gathering where ladies would sip tea, work on their embroidery, and discuss appropriate feminine topics. They were running a sophisticated book-sharing operation. We know from surviving diaries that they had an elaborate system of codes. When a member wanted to recommend a particularly scandalous new novel, she would serve lemon cake at the next tea. When another had acquired a new forbidden book smuggled from England, she would wear her favorite blue ribbon. Bookish rebellion hidden in plain sight. And thanks to their meticulous and hidden records, we know that by 1810, some women in major American cities had access to larger and more diverse collections of novels than most men did. They had created their own literary economy, completely outside the control of the male authorities, nuns and their forbidden libraries. You might think that as we move back further in time, to the even more restrictive medieval period, that the story would get bleaker. But behind the sacred walls of medieval convents, something absolutely extraordinary was happening. While the outside world saw holy women devoted to prayer and piety, these nuns were actually running some of the most sophisticated smuggling operations in history. And what were they smuggling? Not even religious relics. They were smuggling love stories. I know what you're thinking. Nuns reading romance novels? It sounds like the setup to a comedy. But the reality was far more complex and, honestly, far more dangerous than you might imagine. These women faced excommunication, exile, and in some cases, accusations of heresy, all for the simple act of reading about love and passion. Yet they did it anyway. Medieval convents were not the isolated fortresses we often imagine. They were bustling centers of learning, commerce, and art. They were major landowners and scriptoriums, the primary producers of books in era. And some of the visitors, merchants, pilgrims, even wandering scholars, were more than happy to slip a forbidden manuscript to a curious nun in exchange for a blessing or a good meal. The most famous case we know about involves the convent of St. Catherine in England, where in 1289, church investigators discovered what they called the greatest collection of immoral literature north of Paris, hidden in secret compartments throughout the building. They found over 60 manuscripts of romantic poetry, Arthurian legends like Lancelot, and what they euphemistically called tales of courtly love. But here's the mind-blowing part. These were not just random collections. The nuns had created their own international literary network. They had a sophisticated system for copying, sharing, and distributing forbidden literature that would have made modern smugglers proud. We have letters where Sister Adelheid from a German convent discusses with Sister Marie in France, which stories are worth the painstaking effort of copying, and which scribes have the most beautiful handwriting. Their methods for hiding books were incredible. At the Abbey of Fontevraud in France, nuns hollowed out thick religious texts like the Summa Theologica and used them as book safes. They created false bottoms and chests meant for altar cloths, dug hiding spots beneath loose altar stones, and even sewed individual manuscripts into the lining of their religious habits. One of the most ingenious discoveries was a romance novel disguised as a prayer book. The nuns had carefully replaced the original Latin prayers with a Spanish love story, keeping only the decorative borders and religious imagery. It looked like any other holy book. On the inside, it was pure passion and adventure. But why were these women willing to risk everything? The answer goes much deeper than simple entertainment. Many of these nuns had been sent to convents not by choice, but by families who couldn't afford a dowry or wanted to avoid a politically inconvenient marriage. Romantic literature was a window into the life they might have had, the choices they might have made, and the love they might have experienced. It was a validation of their own humanity for deep feeling in a life that demanded its suppression. The church authorities, of course, saw things very differently. In 1277, Bishop Stephen Tempier of Paris issued a condemnation specifically forbidding nuns from reading, copying, or possessing any literature that dealt with. The punishments were severe. Sister Agnes of the convent of St. Etienne was sentenced to bread and water for 6 months after being caught with a copy of Tristan and Isolde. Exile meant being sent to a remote, impoverished convent under the watch of a strict and cruel abbess, a fate many considered worse than death. The underground network was too well established and too clever. They developed a lending library system where books were constantly in circulation between different convents, never staying in one place long enough to be discovered. And some of these nun scholars didn't just read romantic literature. Hidden away in monastery libraries, researchers have found original romantic poetry and stories written by nuns, often under male pseudonyms. They were not just consumers of forbidden literature. They were creators. The medicalization of imagination. As we move away from the medieval period, you might think women's access to literature would have improved with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. The authorities were about to get much more sophisticated in their efforts to control what women could read and think. By the 16th and 17th centuries, they realized that simply banning books was not enough. They needed control of a woman's ability to imagine, to dream, to envision different possibilities for her life. Their weapon of choice was a systematic campaign to convince society that the female imagination was not just dangerous, but literally a form of mental illness. Let me introduce you to Dr. Edward Jordan, a respected English physician who in 1603 published a medical treatise that would influence thinking about women's minds for the next 3 centuries. His book argued that when women read romantic literature, it caused their wombs, yes, their wombs, to literally move around inside their bodies, creating what he called hysterical passions. The word hysteria itself comes from the Greek hystera. This ancient theory proposed that the womb, if not satisfied by pregnancy, and wandered through the body, causing all manner of physical and mental distress. Before you start laughing at the absurdity of wandering wombs, remember that this was not some fringe theory. This was mainstream medical science taught at universities. And the prescribed treatment was complete isolation from all imaginative literature, regular bloodletting to calm the humors, and moral restraint therapy. which was essentially forcing women to spend hours each day copying religious texts to purify their thoughts. The concept of female hysteria caused by reading became so widespread that families started using it as a legal justification for controlling women. Court records from London show hundreds of women were committed to asylums or placed under male guardianship specifically because they had been caught reading novels and were therefore deemed mentally unstable. The truly insidious part of the system was how it made women complicit in their own oppression. Society convinced many women that their own imaginations were dangerous, that their dreams and desires were symptoms of an illness. What's absolutely mind-boggling is that the same doctors and philosophers who were so worried about women's imaginations were simultaneously celebrating imagination as the highest human faculty when it belonged to men. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote eloquently about human freedom, had some absolutely stunning things to say about women in his educational treatise Emile. He argued that while boys should be encouraged to read widely and think creatively, girls should be protected from the dangerous effects of excessive mental stimulation. A woman who thinks is like a man who wears rouge, an abomination against nature. This fear even reached the Salem witch trials. One of the key pieces of evidence used against accused witches was their possession of books, particularly novels. One of the first women executed was found to have a small collection of French novels. The prosecution argued that these books had inflamed her imagination to the point where she believed she could transcend the natural order. A woman lost in a book was a woman whose mind was not properly focused on her domestic duties, and therefore potentially a witch. The Victorian backfire, a revolution in crinoline. Victorian England believed it had perfected the formula for controlling women's minds. It created a society so obsessed with moral purity and domestic duty that women would police themselves. What they got instead was the most spectacular literary rebellion in history, led by some of the most beloved authors of all time. This is a story of how Jane Austen became a dangerous radical, why Charlotte Bronte was considered a threat to civilization, and how a group of proper English ladies accidentally launched a cultural revolution. When Pride and Prejudice was published in 1813, the literary establishment experienced a collective meltdown. Jane Austen had committed an act of literary terrorism. She had created a heroine, Elizabeth Bennet, who talks back to men, who refuses to marry for money, and who believes she has the right to choose her own husband based on love and respect. The Quarterly Review wrote a scathing critique, arguing that Miss Austen's dangerous philosophy could corrupt the minds of young ladies and fill them with unrealistic expectations about marriage. But what truly terrified them was not that Elizabeth Bennet was rebellious. It was that she was intelligent, funny, and confident in her own. She represented a woman who questioned whether the rules of society made sense in the first place. Then in 1847, Charlotte Bronte dropped an even bigger bombshell. Here was a heroine who was poor, plain, and completely unashamed of her passionate feelings. The reviews were savage. The Christian Remembrancer called it a dangerous and immoral book that promoted the overthrow of all established social hierarchies. What really terrified them was Jane's famous declaration to Rochester. "It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, just as if both had passed through the grave, and we stood at God's feet equal, as we are." That was not just romantic dialogue. It was a revolutionary statement about human equality. The panic reached such heights that major circulating libraries, the Netflix of the Victorian era, created protective categories for books that might overstimulate the female imagination. But here is where the campaign began to backfire spectacularly. Instead of creating a generation of compliant women, they had created a generation obsessed with getting their hands on forbidden books. The more the authorities tried to restrict women's reading, the more determined women became. Statistics tell an incredible story. Between 1850 and 1870, circulation at lending libraries increased by over 300%, and the vast majority of new borrowers were women. Publishers began printing cheap, portable editions of novels specifically for women who wanted to read discreetly. By 1865, women accounted for nearly 80% of all novel purchases in Britain. The underground networks for sharing these books became incredibly sophisticated. Ladies' reading circles transformed into book smuggling operations. Frances Powercobbe, a Victorian feminist, described a society in her neighborhood that used them numbers during church services. Mrs. Henderson mentioned M47 during tea, which meant she'd acquired a copy of that scandalous French novel everyone is discussing. What's even more fascinating is that these women were not just passively consuming literature. Their private letters and diaries reveal incredibly sophisticated discussions about narrative technique, character development, and social themes. They were becoming critics, analysts, and thinkers in their own right, and this intellectual awakening was about to connect with a much larger cause. The women who had been told that certain ideas were too dangerous for their minds naturally began to wonder what other ideas they were being protected from. The battle over literary freedom was becoming a battle for women's rights. The rise of a female empire. The moment the very men who had fought so desperately to control women's reading suddenly realized they had created something far more dangerous than any novel was a turning point. They had created a generation of women who understood exactly how power worked and who were about to use that knowledge to build an empire of their own. The revolution began with a simple business observation. Publishers who had survived the moral panic by producing only safe literature were struggling financially. A few daring entrepreneurs discovered that there was enormous money to be made in serving the underground women's market. A publisher named George Palmer Putnam began quietly approaching the leaders of the literary societies instead of smuggling books. What if they could buy them directly from a publisher who understood their needs? The response was overwhelming. But Putnam's real genius was in understanding that these women were not just consumers. They were sophisticated literary critics. He began consulting with them about which books to publish and how to market them. The women who had been running secret distribution networks suddenly found themselves as the first female literary agents and marketing consultants in American history. The financial results were staggering. Putnam's sales increased by over 400%, almost entirely due to the female market. Soon, women realized they didn't just have to influence publishing. They could be the publishers. Sarah Josepha Hale, a former member of these circles, became the editor of Godey's Lady's Book, the most influential women's magazine in 19th century America. Under her leadership, the magazine became a platform for women writers, publishing fiction that explored themes of female independence and intelligence. She did it so skillfully, framing these radical ideas in terms of moral improvement, that even conservatives found it difficult to object. The economic empowerment of women through literature had profound political implications. Authors like Fanny Fern became bestsellers, earning more money than most male professionals. She used her newspaper columns to encourage women to read everything. Read philosophy, read newspapers, read whatever feeds your starving minds. The money these women earned funded suffrage campaigns, scholarships for female students, and social reform movements. The same underground networks that once shared romance novels became the distribution system for one of the most politically influential books in American history, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. By 1880, women authors were dominating the bestseller lists, writing about business, politics, and social reform, topics previously considered exclusively male domains. The battle over women's right to read had evolved into women's right to write, and from there, to women's right to full participation in intellectual and professional life. The final victory, a digital revolution. Fast forward to the dawn of the 20th century, and the romance novel, that supposedly frivolous genre, was becoming the most powerful economic force in the literary world, now dominated by women who were writing for other women. Pioneers like E.L. Voynich and Eleanor Glynn shattered taboos about female desire, becoming international sensations. Publishing houses like Mills and Boon were founded, creating the first female-centered creative industry. But the final, decisive victory came with the digital age. The internet didn't just change how women access love stories. It completely obliterated every barrier that had ever been used to control, write, or share. It began in the 1990s with simple online discussion groups. These quickly exploded into communities of thousands. But these women didn't just consume romance. They began to transform it. They started writing their own stories, creating elaborate fictional universes, and sharing them with each other. They invented fanfiction. Women could write stories that reflected their actual fantasies and desires, without worrying about male editors or conservative critics. Then came self-publishing platforms. Women who had been writing for online communities could now publish their work professionally and earn money from it, completely bypassing the traditional gatekeepers. The results were spectacular. Yale James's 50 Shades of Grey, which started as fanfiction, sold over 125 million copies. But she was just the tip of the iceberg. Thousands of women became best-selling authors with six-figure incomes. By 2015, romance novels accounted for over $1 billion in annual revenue in the U.S. alone, and the vast majority of successful authors were women who had started in digital communities. They had created their own industry with their own rules. The shame and secrecy that had characterized women's relationship with romance for centuries simply evaporated in the face of these massive, supportive online communities. The battle that had begun with a few brave women sneaking forbidden books into medieval convents had finally, decisively and permanently been won, a legacy of imagination. And here we are, at the end of our incredible journey. What strikes me most about this story is that it was never really just about books. It was always about something much deeper. The right of every human being to dream, to imagine, and to envision a life beyond the limitations others try to place on them. The authorities who spent centuries trying to control what women read were not really afraid of romance novels. They were afraid of women who believed they deserved happiness, who imagined they could make their own choices, and who dared to think their minds were worth developing. Every single attempt to suppress women's reading ultimately backfired spectacularly. The medieval church's campaign created underground networks that preserved literature through the Dark Ages. The Victorian moral panic accidentally trained women to organize and think strategically. The American religious surveillance system taught women skills they would later use to fight for suffrage and civil rights. The lesson here is profound and hopeful. Human intelligence and creativity are like water. They will always find a way around any obstacle. You can build walls and create restrictions, but in the end, the human spirit's need to grow, learn, and create will overcome every barrier. The freedom we take for granted today was fought for, inch by inch, by women who refuse to accept that their minds belong to anyone but themselves. The story we've told tonight reveals something fascinating about how social change really works. It's not usually dramatic revolutions that transform society. It's the quiet, persistent resistance of ordinary people who simply refuse to accept limitations on their humanity. Thank you so much for joining me on this remarkable journey to the hidden history of women and love stories. I hope it's given you a new appreciation for the power of literature, the importance of intellectual freedom, and the incredible courage of those who came before us. Sweet dreams. Every time you pick up a book and let yourself be transported to another world, you are participating in one of the most revolutionary acts in human history. You are proving that imagination cannot be conquered, that stories cannot be silenced, and that the human spirit will always find a way to soar. Until our next adventure together, keep reading, keep dreaming, and keep believing in the transformative power of a good story. Good night, my friends.